Swinson.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Taylor. And can I start by congratulating the Honourable Member for the Cities of London and Westminster on securing this debate and, may I say, opening it with such eloquence, setting out issues of the economic challenges that the UK and other countries will be facing in the context of China's growth and emergence as an economic powerhouse. I think it's obviously an important subject for us to discuss, and as is often the way with 90-minute debates in Westminster Hall, we could obviously spend much more time discussing it because there are so many different aspects. We've obviously heard about the economic side, and then also the contribution from the Honourable Member from North Wiltshire, focusing much more on the issue of Tibet. The recent celebrations, obviously, of the 60th anniversary of the People's Republic of China were well publicised, but I do have to say I share the concern expressed by the honourable members about the fact that they chose to do so with cruise missiles, unmanned drones and nuclear missile carriers, not necessarily what most people would think to be the main symbol of their country's pride. And I think, as I will touch on in my remarks, there is a genuine concern to be had about the freedom of expression, the human rights situation within China. Although I always think it's important when we start to pass judgment about other countries that we also look to our own country and the difficulties that we have. And I think it's particularly interesting that today we have, of course, had the Guardian, a national newspaper, effectively being gagged from reporting on Parliament with the Trafigura issue. So I think there is also the importance of just recalling that we don't necessarily have everything perfect in our own country. Although I think what's interesting on that is how that has been taken up by the internet. And of course, the member for North Wiltshire pointed out the rise of the huge number of thousands of bloggers in China. And I think that ultimately issues about freedom of expression in China will actually be dealt with by the increasing use of the internet, which, although China does spend a great deal of money trying to repress, shutting down sites, there's been lots of different YouTube and other websites which have from time to time had content removed from China. For example, if you go to Beijing and you Google Tiananmen Square, you will get information about the history of this landmark and going along to it as a tourist attraction, but you will not receive any news within that web search on the atrocities which happened there. So I think ultimately, although they do try to repress the internet, it will end up being a tool for opening up democracy within that country. Obviously, the huge economic growth of China has also brought with it much greater political influence, and in many different diplomatic areas, China is becoming increasingly important, whether it's nuclear proliferation in North Korea and Iran to human rights issues in Burma, Sudan, Zimbabwe and Sri Lanka. And the challenge for the UK is to work out how best to engage with China across that range of issues, not least, and I will come to the issue of climate change, in which China has got an absolutely crucial role to play. So I would like to welcome the government's strategy published earlier this year, the UK and China, a framework for engagement, and I will pick up on some points from that in my remarks. I think if there is anything good to have come out of the global recession, it's sometimes important to look for silver linings. It is unprecedented international cooperation on economic matters. And this is going to be important as we face global challenges, trying to have a transition to a low-carbon global economy, for example, as we approach peak oil. I think it's very welcome that the G7 has recently decided to make way for G20 as a forum for global economic discussion. It's absolutely vital that we recognise the importance of the emerging economies in such talks, such as China, India and Brazil. And I think China's importance in the move from G7 to G20 as that forum is obviously absolutely key. And we need to go further and reform other international institutions, such as the IMF, to make sure that the realpolitik of the global environment is much better represented. China, as the honourable member pointed out, the differences in the structure of the economy that China has had versus the economies in the West. China's saving rate in 2008 was over half of its GDP, and while China is actually requiring to reduce saving, it's quite the opposite in terms of what we are needing to do. It's recognising its people need to spend more to increase and improve its stability, and the as they reform their welfare state, their healthcare systems, that will actually reduce the incentives for the Chinese to save so much of their income, which is effectively an insurance policy and safety net that they create for themselves. So they're having to change their mindset and their culture in terms of their economic habits, and we equally need to do the same. The average adult in the UK owes more than £30,000, and this personal debt, as I'm sure all honourable members will be aware, is a huge burden that people are bearing within the difficulties of the recession, and I think it is an essential task for the government to reform the regulation of credit and debt within the UK, so that it is no longer possible for people to get into such unsustainable personal debt. The hordes of junk mail letters that come through people's letterboxes urging them to take out thousands and thousands of pounds more of debt really do need to be curbed. Sorry.
Just on that point, in the same way the honourable member is arguing that the government should have responsibility with regards to how much its debt builds up, surely consumers themselves have a responsibility to decide how much debt that they should be taking on.
I mean, the honourable gentleman is quite right that consumers also have a responsibility, although I would argue that there is a role within financial education, because it's difficult for people to take on that responsibility if they are not well informed about the different products that are available, about what an APR means. I think there needs to be much more information in a very accessible format, both within the formal education system at school, but also for people who have left education to be able to access that kind of advice. Yes, people do need to take responsibilities, but that does not let companies off the hook who act in irresponsible ways, both in terms of lending more than people are able to pay back, and also in sky-high interest rates, which are just unjustifiable.
The Honourable Lady seems to be wandering a little from the main topic that we're debating. Joe Swinson.
I welcome your advice, Mr Taylor, and shall return to the specifics of China. As China is becoming the biggest economy in the world, we have to make sure we maximise the benefits for the UK. We are the top EU investor in China, and it's right that this should continue. I welcome the government's stated aim to equip British people with a much better understanding of China and Chinese language skills as well. And I wonder whether the Minister in his remarks might enlighten us about how the government intends to do this. On my visit to China, I was struck by just the language barrier being so huge, because it's not just, of course, a language, it's an entire alphabet and different symbols. So I'm not convinced it's necessarily an easy language to learn, but nonetheless we should be encouraging that to be happening to build better relations economically and more widely. I'd like to touch on the issue of climate change, which I think is an absolutely crucial issue in terms of our relations with China. China has quickly become the world's biggest polluter, and we need to have its commitment at Copenhagen in December if we are to achieve a good deal. I was very lucky to visit China last year with the Environmental Audit Committee. We were undertaking an inquiry in the international context of climate change post-Kyoto. And I have to say I was pleasantly surprised by the efforts that the Chinese were already making on this issue. They did seem to be truly committed to reducing emissions per yuan of GDP, which is very welcome. But of course, the challenge that we're facing is just the scale of the change taking place in China. The industrial pollution was mentioned earlier in the debate as a very visible sign. I was struck by the huge sort of motorways going through Beijing, 8 lanes wide and absolutely gridlocked, the amount of increase in vehicle traffic. The fact that there are still hundreds of millions of Chinese without access to electricity means there's rightly and understandably a real incentive and imperative for the Chinese government to improve those living standards. But of course, the downside of that is it means that they're rapidly building more coal-fired power stations. So working with the Chinese on the issue of climate change is absolutely essential. I will certainly give way.
On that subject again, I think particularly given the subject of the debate that we're talking about, which is UK relations with China, the UK does have a particular expertise in carbon capture, carbon sequestration, which BP have been leading, I think, in Scotland. And surely we should be using that technology as a means to enhance our relationship with China, because they have about 200 to 300 years' worth supply of coal, particularly dirty coal. And working with the Chinese, perhaps using this technology, we can help enhance our relationship and improve climate change.
The Honourable Gentleman is quite right that technology transfer is a vital part of that relationship, although, again, one of the things that surprised me going to China is actually how far ahead they are already on technology such as carbon capture and storage. And we met with the collaboration of 7 different companies which had come together, although I think they're mainly state companies, even though they've got different names, within China to be working on CCS. And I actually think that the speed that we're progressing on this in the UK, there's a real danger that they will actually get the technology up and running before we do, although we obviously should be making sure that we share that knowledge and information, because it's an absolutely essential piece of technology, because as the Honourable Gentleman rightly says, China has got coal. It will be wanting to make sure that it provides electricity, and it's going to do that through these dirty coal-fired power stations, which we have to make sure CCS technology can be retrofitted to. The other things I think we could sometimes learn from China in terms of climate change, their stimulus package last November announced a huge investment of £90 billion a year for 2 years in high-speed rail. The maglev technology, which has already been mentioned in this debate, whereas the high-speed rail in the UK, again, is lagging far behind, which would provide a much lower carbon alternative to domestic flights. The Copenhagen conference is only weeks away now. I'm very pleased that the Prime Minister himself has decided to attend it. It's quite right that the world leaders at the very top should be meeting, and I would say to the Minister that failure is just not an option. This is far too important an issue, and we absolutely need to make sure that we get China, as the world's biggest polluter, on board with that. I'd just like to turn quickly to some of the issues of human rights, some of which have already been raised. Of course, China is actually contributing huge amounts of development aid in developing countries, but this is often being used as a way to buy influence, and the aid is being used in exchange for access to energy resources. The energy security issue for China seems to be driving huge amounts of what they do. And this has shown quite a few problems within the international sphere when China has then failed to use its influence to prevent human rights abuses, for example, in Sudan. And I hope the government will continue to pressurise China to use the leverage they've got in Sudan to end the support for the militias causing such destruction and committing so many awful atrocities in Darfur, because it's absolutely vital that China, in having this huge economic power, also uses the political power that it increasingly has. And that's why the government's aim of encouraging China to define its interests more broadly, as outlined in the framework document, is absolutely right. We heard about the Tibet issue from the Honourable Member for North Wiltshire, and I would welcome the Minister's colleague's visit recently to Tibet and his article on the Guardian website about the general issue of human rights, including reassurance that, and I quote, "this human rights deficit features prominently in our dialogue with China." It's absolutely important that while we recognise the economic and political power that China has, there are still a variety of issues where its record is, I think, from a civilised society's point of view, unacceptable. And we need to make sure that we delicately and with the balance that is required, that we do continue to raise these issues and encourage China to move. I will give way.
We're giving way, and a point I forgot to mention during my own contribution, namely that some of us felt that when the government slipped through this place incidentally without a formal ministerial statement, our change in policy with regard to Tibet and saying that Tibet was now understood to be a fully integrated part of the People's Republic of China, we felt that the government also failed to use that sufficiently well as a lever to persuade the Chinese to address some of the human rights issues within Tibet itself. And I hope that actually the Minister's recent visit, when he raised 19 individual human rights issues, will be a portent for the future when the government actually take a stronger line with the Chinese government on these human rights issues.
The Honourable Gentleman makes his point very well, and I hope the Minister will address those comments in his reply. And I do hope that that visit does signal a renewed commitment to finding solutions to the many problems that are ongoing in Tibet. In conclusion, Mr Taylor, I welcome the move of the publication of the UK National Strategy on these relations with China. It's absolutely vital, clearly, that we build strong ties as China grows in influence politically and economically. At the same time, Britain's influence on the world stage has declined over recent decades, if we think back to the glory days that are often cited. And I think the best way that we can make our influence felt will often be to work closely with our EU partners and be a strong voice within the EU. I imagine the Minister being well aware of this, particularly in his new role, which I congratulate him on. Obviously, we have many points of contention with Chinese domestic and foreign policy, but we are increasingly learning to cooperate with each other on a wide range of issues, from the economy to climate change, and I very much look forward to hearing the Minister's remarks.